You fall asleep. Everything is normal. The room is dark, the sheets are warm, and the world outside your window has gone quiet. But then, sometime in the deepest hours of the night, you wake up, or at least part of you does. Your mind stirs into consciousness. Your eyes flutter open, and you realize something is very, very wrong. You cannot move. Not your arms, not your legs, not even a single finger. Your chest feels heavy, like something massive is pressing down on you, and the air you're pulling in through your nose barely seems like enough. And then, in the corner of the room, or at the foot of your bed, or sometimes right on top of your chest, you see it. A figure, a shadow, a presence that radiates a kind of malice that you have never felt while awake. You want to scream, but your mouth will not open. You want to run, but your body will not obey. All you can do is lie there, paralyzed, while the terror swallows you whole. For most people, this experience, as horrifying as it is, eventually ends. The body catches up to the mind, the paralysis breaks, and the figure dissolves into the darkness of the bedroom like it was never there at all. But for some people, the experience doesn't end. For some people, the terror that comes in the night is the last thing they ever feel. And when their loved ones find them the next morning, still and cold in their beds, there is no wound, no poison, no weapon, and no explanation. Just a body that stopped living sometime in the night for reasons that no autopsy, no toxicology screen, and no medical expert can explain. This has happened to hundreds of people, and in some parts of the world, it has happened to thousands. Across the Philippines, Thailand, Japan, Laos, and the refugee communities of the United States, people have been found dead in their beds with no mark on their bodies and no poison in their blood. These are real stories, real deaths, and real mysteries. And for over a century, the medical establishment has struggled to explain how a healthy person can simply die in their sleep after what appears to be a nightmare. To understand these deaths, we first have to understand what sleep paralysis actually is and why, across every culture on Earth, human beings have been telling stories about the thing that sits on your chest in the dark. Sleep is not the simple, passive state that most of us imagine it to be. When you close your eyes and drift off, your brain doesn't just shut down like a computer powering off for the night. Instead, it cycles through a series of complex stages, each with its own patterns of electrical activity, its own chemical cocktails, and its own unique characteristics. The most fascinating and most relevant of these stages for our purposes is called rapid eye movement sleep, or REM sleep. This is the phase where the most vivid dreaming occurs, where your brain becomes almost as electrically active as it is when you are wide awake, and where something truly remarkable happens to your body. During REM sleep, your brain essentially paralyzes your muscles. This is a protective mechanism, a safeguard evolved over millennia to keep you from physically acting out your dreams. Imagine if every time you dreamed about running, your legs actually started sprinting beneath the sheets. You would thrash yourself right out of bed and probably injure yourself in the process. So your brain, in its infinite wisdom, sends signals down through your spinal cord that temporarily disable voluntary muscle movement. Scientists call this muscle atonia, and under normal circumstances, it is perfectly harmless. You are asleep, you are dreaming, and your body stays still. But sometimes the system glitches, and when it does, the results are terrifying beyond anything most people can imagine until they experience it themselves. Sometimes, The boundary between sleep and wakefulness becomes blurred, and you find yourself in a strange liminal state where your mind has woken up, but your body hasn't followed. You are aware, you can see, you can hear, but you are locked inside your own body like a prisoner in a cell made of flesh and bone. Your eyes are open, you can see your bedroom around you, you can feel the sheets against your skin, but you cannot move. This is sleep paralysis, and it is far more common than most people realize. Studies estimate that somewhere between 8 and 30% of the general population will experience at least one episode in their lifetime. And for some people, particularly those who are sleep deprived, stressed, or suffering from certain psychiatric conditions, the episodes can become a recurring torment. But the immobility is only part of what makes sleep paralysis so deeply terrifying. Because you are straddling the line between REM sleep and wakefulness, the dreaming parts of your brain are still active, even as you become aware of your actual surroundings. This means that your brain is essentially projecting dream imagery onto the real world, overlaying hallucinations onto the bedroom you know and recognize. And these are not pleasant hallucinations. The amygdala, the part of your brain responsible for processing fear, is firing at full capacity, flooding your system with dread and panic. The result is that people who experience sleep paralysis almost universally report 3 types of hallucinations. The first is the sense of a threatening presence in the room, a shadowy figure or a malevolent entity that you know with absolute certainty wants to harm you. The second is the feeling of pressure on the chest, as if something heavy is sitting on you, crushing the air out of your lungs. And the third involves out-of-body sensations, feelings of floating, being pulled, or being transported against your will. Now, for the vast majority of people who experience this, the episode ends within seconds to a few minutes. The paralysis breaks, and while the person may be shaken and terrified, they are ultimately fine. Their heart rate comes down, their breathing normalizes, and life goes on. But what happens when the terror doesn't end? What happens when the fear itself becomes a weapon? When the hallucination and the panic trigger a chain of biological events that the body simply cannot survive? That question has haunted researchers for over a century, and the answer, it turns out, stretches back thousands of years. Long before modern neuroscience could explain what was happening during sleep paralysis, human beings across every inhabited continent were telling remarkably similar stories about creatures that attacked people in their sleep. The consistency of these stories across cultures that had no contact with one another is one of the most striking things about the phenomenon, and it suggests that sleep paralysis is not a modern affliction, but something that has plagued humanity since we first began sleeping in caves and shelters. The earliest known reference to this kind of nocturnal attack dates back to ancient Mesopotamia, around 2400 BC, where Sumerian texts describe a class of demons known as Lilitu, female spirits who preyed upon men while they slept. These were the predecessors of Lilith, a figure who would go on to appear in Hebrew texts and later in the folklore of medieval Europe. Lilith was described as a seductress and a destroyer, a being who came in the night to steal breath and drain life from her victims. And her method of attack, sitting or lying upon the sleeper, pressing down on their body until they could not breathe, is a description that any modern sleep paralysis sufferer would immediately recognize. From Mesopotamia, the tradition migrated and mutated across cultures. In ancient Rome, the night visitor was called the incubus, from the Latin word incubare, meaning to lie upon. The incubus was a male demon that assaulted women during sleep, while its female counterpart, the succubus, targeted men. In medieval Europe, These beings became deeply embedded in the religious framework of the time, with the Catholic Church documenting hundreds of cases of what it considered demonic nocturnal assault. During the Salem witch trials in colonial Massachusetts, several accusers described being attacked in their beds at night by the specters of alleged witches, unable to move or cry out. Given what we now know about sleep paralysis, it is entirely possible that some of those accusations were born not from malice or superstition alone, but from genuine neurological experiences that the accusers had no other way to explain. In Scandinavia, the night visitor was called the mare, an Old Norse word that is, notably, the direct etymological ancestor of our modern English word nightmare. The mare was described as a spirit, often a damned woman, who would ride the chests of sleeping men and horses alike, leaving them exhausted and terrified by morning. In Iceland, the experience is still called having a mara, and the folklore surrounding it remains deeply embedded in the culture. In China, the phenomenon is described as ghost pressing on the body, and folklore tells of a mouse spirit that steals human breath at night. In Turkey, it is the karabasan, the dark presser. In the Arab world, it is the jathum, literally meaning that which sits heavily. In the Caribbean island of St. Lucia, a creature called the kokma attacks sleeping infants. In Japan, it is known as kanashibari, which translates roughly to bound in metal, a reference to the immobility that victims experience. But perhaps no cultural tradition has explored this phenomenon as richly or as darkly as the folklore of Newfoundland, Canada, where generations of settlers carried with them from the British Isles a deeply rooted belief in a being they called the Old Hag. The Old Hag of Newfoundland is described as a witch-like figure, a wrinkled, withered old woman with long, tangled hair who creeps into bedrooms in the dead of night. She crawls from the foot of the bed up to the victim's chest, where she perches and presses down with supernatural weight, pinning the sleeper in place while they suffocate beneath her. The experience of being visited by the Old Hag was so common in Newfoundland that it developed its own vocabulary. People spoke of being hag-ridden or hagged, and in manuscripts dating back to the 1890s in the province, remedies and countermeasures were passed down through families. One account describes a man who was so tormented by the Old Hag that he was advised to drive nails through a wooden shingle and strap it to his chest before going to sleep, the theory being that the Old Hag would impale herself when she tried to sit on him. It was in Newfoundland that one of the most important researchers into this phenomenon, Dr. David Hufford, began his groundbreaking work in the 1970s. Hufford, a professor at Penn State who had been studying folklore and folk medicine, traveled to Newfoundland to interview people about their experiences with the Old Hag. What he discovered stunned him. The accounts he collected were remarkably consistent, not just with each other, but with accounts from cultures around the world that had no connection to Newfoundland whatsoever. Hufford published his findings in a landmark 1982 book that would become essential reading for anyone studying sleep paralysis. His research established a critical point. These experiences were not simply cultural inventions or superstitions passed down through stories. They were genuine physiological events that people in every culture interpreted through whatever lens their society provided. The experience was real and universal. Only the explanations varied. Perhaps the most hauntingly beautiful and disturbing depiction of sleep paralysis in Western art came in 1781 when the Swiss artist Henri Fuseli painted a work simply titled The Nightmare. The painting shows a young woman sprawled across a bed in a swoon, her arms dangling limply and her head thrown back. Squatting on her stomach is a grotesque, ape-like creature, an incubus, staring directly out at the viewer with a knowing, malevolent expression. Behind the curtains, the head of a horse with wild, luminous eyes pushes through, a visual reference to the mare of Germanic folklore. The painting became one of the most reproduced and discussed works of its era, and it resonated so powerfully because virtually everyone who saw it recognized some element of the experience it depicted. It was, in every sense, a portrait of something that had been happening to human beings since before recorded history. But while the folklore was fascinating and the art was evocative, nothing could have prepared the world for what happened when this ancient nocturnal terror began killing people in staggering numbers. It begins in the Philippines, where the sudden death of young men in their sleep has been documented longer than anywhere else on Earth. In 1917, a Filipino physician named Maria Paz Mendoza Guazon published a paper in a Spanish-language medical journal describing a pattern of death that had long been known in Filipino culture but had never been formally documented in medical literature. The phenomenon was called Bangungut, a Tagalog word derived from bangun, meaning to rise, and ongol, meaning to moan. Together, the word roughly translates to moaning while rising from sleep, which described the most commonly observed behavior of victims in the moments before death. The pattern was always eerily similar. A young man, healthy and strong, with no history of illness or medical complaints, would eat a large meal in the evening, often heavy with rice and other starches, and go to bed. Sometime in the deepest hours of the night, usually around 3 a.m, his sleeping companions or family members would hear him begin to groan, to thrash, to gasp for air. They would try to wake him, shaking him, calling his name, but he would be utterly unresponsive, trapped in a state that looked like the most violent nightmare imaginable. And then, if he could not be roused, he would simply stop breathing and die. By morning, his body would be cool, his face sometimes frozen in an expression of distress, and the people who loved him would be left with nothing but grief and bewilderment. Filipino folklore had a ready explanation. The deaths were blamed on a vengeful nature spirit from Ilocano tradition called the Batibat, a massive, terrifying female entity associated with certain trees. The Batibat was typically depicted as an enormous, grotesque old woman, obese and powerful, who made her home in the trunks of trees in the deep forest. According to legend, if a tree that housed a Batibat was cut down and the wood used to build a home, or, more specifically, the posts of a bed, the displaced spirit would take its revenge by sitting on the chest of the person sleeping in that bed and suffocating them to death. The Batibat was relentless and vindictive. She did not simply frighten her victims. She crushed them, pressing down with supernatural weight until their lungs could no longer draw air and their hearts could no longer beat. Men were the primary targets, and the only way to survive was to be roused from sleep before the Batibat completed her suffocating work, or, according to some versions of the legend, to bite your own thumb or wiggle your toes, which would break the spell and force the spirit to withdraw. Families developed elaborate rituals around this belief. Sleeping positions were carefully chosen, with many men avoiding lying on their backs because it was believed that the supine position made them more vulnerable. Prayers were recited before bed, talismans were placed beneath pillows, and in some households, family members would take turns staying awake through the night to watch over their sleeping relatives, ready to shake them awake at the first sign of groaning or distress. The Batibat even entered modern popular culture. The creature appeared in the 5th episode of the Netflix series Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, and in the 2nd season of the Canadian supernatural drama, demonstrating just how far the folklore has traveled from its origins in the Philippine provinces. The medical community's investigation of Bangungut unfolded slowly over the decades that followed Mendoza Guazon's initial paper. Between 1948 and 1982, researchers reviewed over 700 death certificates in Manila that carried diagnoses related to sudden, unexplained death during sleep. The findings were startlingly consistent. 96% of the victims were male. The average age at the time of death was 33 years old. The deaths showed a seasonal pattern, peaking during December and January, and the most common time of death was around 3 in the morning. Perhaps most disturbingly, the rate of these deaths actually increased over the period studied, rising from around 10.8 per 100,000 men to 26.3 per 100,000. A later national survey conducted in the Philippines in 2003 found the prevalence to be even higher, estimating that approximately 43 out of every 100,000 Filipinos died from Bangungut each year. If those numbers are extrapolated across the entire Philippine population, it translates to tens of thousands of unexplained nocturnal deaths annually, making it one of the most significant public health challenges in the country. And yet, for decades, the medical establishment could not explain what was causing it. The most famous case attributed to Bangungut in the Philippines, and the one that brought the phenomenon to the attention of an entirely new generation, was the death of actor Rico Yan in 2002. Born Ricardo Carlos Castro Yan. On March 14, 1975, Rico grew up in a prominent Filipino family with deep roots in the military and business worlds. His grandfather had served as the chief of staff of the armed forces of the Philippines and later as ambassador to several countries. Rico attended prestigious schools in Manila before graduating from De La Salle University with a degree in business management. But it was not business that would define his life. From the moment he entered show business in 1995, first as a commercial model and then as a member of ABS-CBN's inaugural Star Circle talent batch, Rico Yan became one of the most beloved figures in Philippine entertainment. He was known for his dimpled smile, his humility, and his effortless charm. He starred alongside the biggest names in Filipino cinema, appeared in hit television series like Gimmick and Mula sa Puso, and became the very definition of a matinee idol. He was 27 years old, healthy, at the peak of his career, and had just finished filming what would become his final movie, a romantic comedy called Got to Believe, which had already become a box office sensation. During Holy Week in late March of that year, Rico traveled with friends and colleagues to the Dos Palmas Resort in Puerto Princesa, Palawan, for what was supposed to be a relaxing vacation. The night before his death, he had attended a party with friends where, according to reports, he had eaten a large meal of seafood and consumed drinks. He sang songs from his latest film that evening, seeming happy and in good spirits, and eventually retired to his hotel room. The next morning, his friend and fellow actor Dominic Ochoa went to check on him and found him unresponsive in bed. Rico Yan was dead. The autopsy determined that the cause of death was cardiac arrest resulting from acute hemorrhagic pancreatitis. But in the public mind, and in the headlines that followed, the word that appeared again and again was Bangungut. The nation mourned. An estimated 10,000 people attended his funeral, and his burial was televised live across the country. His death reignited conversations about the mysterious sleep phenomenon, and for many Filipinos, it was a chilling reminder that Bangungut did not discriminate. It could take the young, the healthy, the famous, and the beloved just as easily as anyone else. Thousands of miles to the northwest of the Philippines, in the rural villages of northeastern Thailand, a strikingly similar phenomenon had been claiming lives for generations. Only here, it went by a different name and carried with it an entirely different mythology. In Thailand, the mysterious deaths were called lai tai, a phrase that translates roughly to died while dreaming or died while screaming in sleep, depending on the dialect. And for the villagers of the Isan region, the vast northeastern plateau that borders Laos and Cambodia, lai tai was not a medical mystery. It was the work of the Phai Mai Mai, the widow ghost. According to Thai folklore, the widow ghost was the restless spirit of a woman who had died before her time, often a young widow or a woman who had been wronged in life. She wandered the countryside at night, seeking out healthy young men to take as spiritual companions in the afterlife. She was described as beautiful at a distance, but terrifying up close, with hollow eyes and a hunger that could never be satisfied. The method was always the same. She would visit a man while he slept, pressing down upon him, stealing his breath, and dragging his soul into the spirit world before he could wake. Once she had chosen a victim, escape was nearly impossible. The community's fear of the widow ghost was not abstract or casual. It was immediate and visceral, a terror woven into the daily fabric of life in the villages. Families in northeastern Thailand took this threat with deadly seriousness, and the countermeasures they employed were as creative as they were desperate. It was common practice for young men to paint their fingernails with feminine nail polish before going to sleep, or to wear women's nightgowns or sarongs to bed. The theory being that the widow ghost would be deceived into thinking she had found a woman instead of a man, and would move on to search for male prey elsewhere. Some families even placed carved wooden effigies of male genitalia outside their homes as decoys, hoping to redirect the spirit's attention away from the actual men sleeping inside. These phallic figures were displayed prominently, without embarrassment or hesitation, because the stakes were life and death. Other villages erected spirit houses, small ornate structures near the entrances of their communities, dedicated specifically to warding off the widow ghost and other malevolent spirits. And offerings of food, incense, and flowers were placed there daily. But regardless of the precautions taken, the deaths continued. A systematic epidemiological survey conducted in the late 1980s and early 1990s examined sudden unexplained deaths in nearly 4,000 villages across northeastern Thailand. The findings were sobering. Among men aged 20 to 49, the annual death rate from lai tai was estimated at between 26 and 38 per 100,000. Every single verified victim was male. The average age at the time of death was roughly 36 years old, and the deaths showed a seasonal clustering, peaking between March and May, which is the hottest time of the year in the region and also corresponds to the period of heaviest agricultural labor. Perhaps most disturbingly, 40% of the victims had a family history of similar deaths, and more than 18% had brothers who had died the same way, strongly suggesting a hereditary component that the folklore, for all its richness, could not account for. The phenomenon gained international attention in 1990 when it surfaced far from the rice paddies of Isan, in the unlikely setting of a tropical island city-state. Starting in May of 1982, young Thai construction workers in Singapore began dying in their sleep at an alarming rate. These were men who had traveled from the impoverished northeast of Thailand to work on Singapore's booming construction projects, part of a massive wave of migrant labor that fueled the city-state's rapid development during the 1980s. They sent money home to their families, lived in crowded dormitories with dozens of other workers, ate communal meals that were often heavy in carbohydrates and low in essential nutrients like potassium and thiamine, and worked grueling hours in punishing tropical heat. They were young, they were strong, and they were doing what they thought was the responsible thing for their families back home. And one by one, sometimes sporadically, sometimes in clusters that terrified their co-workers, they began to die. The deaths occurred singly, without geographic clustering, and seemed to strike at random. A man would go to sleep in his bunk alongside his co-workers, and by morning he would be dead. His bunkmates would describe hearing strange sounds in the night, a groaning or a gurgling, the rasping sound of labored breathing. But by the time anyone was alert enough to realize what was happening, it was already too late. Between May of 1982 and July of 1990, at least 230 otherwise healthy young Thai men died suddenly and inexplicably in their sleep in Singapore. Some reports put the number even higher, at 235 or more. The median age at death was 33 years old, and the median interval between arriving in Singapore and dying was just 8 months. Autopsies revealed virtually nothing. The men's hearts showed no blockages, no structural abnormalities, no evidence of disease. Their lungs were congested, a finding consistent with the agonal breathing that witnesses often described in the moments before death. But this was a consequence of dying, not a cause. Toxicology screens were negative. The men had simply gone to sleep and never woken up, and nobody could explain why. The Singapore death sent shockwaves through the Thai government and the international medical community. Thai physicians were dispatched to Singapore to work alongside local doctors, visiting construction sites, interviewing frightened workers, and distributing first aid kits. Workers were taught CPR in the hope that they could resuscitate their colleagues if they heard the telltale groaning and gasping that preceded death. The investigation that followed would last years and would ultimately lead to one of the most important medical discoveries of the 20th century. But before we get there, we need to follow the trail of this phenomenon across the Pacific Ocean, where it was about to claim its most famous and most controversial victims. In 1975, the Vietnam War ended, and the political landscape of Southeast Asia was irrevocably altered. Laos, the small landlocked country wedged between Vietnam, Thailand, Cambodia, and China, fell under communist control. For the Hmong people, an ethnic minority group that had lived for centuries in the mountainous highlands of Laos, herding animals, farming terraced fields, and maintaining a rich oral tradition of storytelling and spiritual practice, this was a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. During the war, the American CIA had recruited tens of thousands of Hmong soldiers to fight against the North Vietnamese in what became known as the Secret War, a covert military campaign that the American government denied for years. More than 30,000 Hmong men took up arms at the CIA's request, fighting with extraordinary bravery in the rugged highlands, suffering casualty rates 10 times higher than their American counterparts. They were not soldiers by training or inclination. They were farmers, fathers, and sons who had been drawn into a superpower conflict that they barely understood, and when the war was lost and the Americans withdrew, the Hmong were abandoned. The new communist government of Laos, the Pathet Lao, viewed the Hmong as traitors and collaborators. Many were hunted down, imprisoned, sent to re-education camps, or killed outright. Thousands fled on foot through the jungle in conditions of unimaginable hardship, crossing the Mekong River into Thailand under the cover of darkness, often carrying small children and elderly relatives on their backs. They left behind their homes, their farms, their ancestral burial grounds, the sacred landscapes where their spirits dwelled, and in many heartbreaking cases, family members who could not make the journey. It was a forced migration carried out under the most harrowing conditions imaginable, and for those who survived the trek through malarial jungle, the drowning currents of the Mekong, and the squalor of the Thai refugee camps, the trauma was only beginning. From the refugee camps of Thailand, tens of thousands of Hmong were eventually resettled in the United States. They arrived in American cities and suburbs speaking no English, possessing few marketable skills, and carrying the invisible weight of war, displacement, and grief. The U.S. government, in an effort to prevent any single city or region from bearing the full economic burden of resettlement, implemented a dispersal policy that scattered Hmong families across the country. Brothers were separated from brothers. Parents were separated from children. Entire clans that had lived together for generations were broken apart and distributed to different states. And the consequences of this fragmentation would prove far more deadly than anyone could have anticipated. Beginning in 1977, Hmong men in America started dying in their sleep. The pattern was the same one that had been documented in the Philippines and Thailand. Healthy young men, no history of illness, dying in the night for no apparent reason. The first case is generally attributed to a man named Lee Hawa, a medic who had been described by everyone who knew him as both healthy and health conscious, living in California. He went to bed one night and simply never woke up. But Lee Hawa was not the last. Over the years that followed, the deaths multiplied. Wives would wake in the middle of the night to find their husbands groaning and gasping, thrashing against invisible restraints. And by the time they shook them hard enough to try to rouse them, it was too late. One case that was widely reported in 1981 involved a 47-year-old Hmong man named Yong Leng Thao, who had escaped persecution in Laos, survived a refugee camp in Thailand, and relocated to the United States with his family. He was settling into his new life in America when, one night, he died in his sleep with his sobbing wife beside him. He was the fourth Hmong man to die while sleeping in just 9 months, and the 13th nocturnal Hmong death recorded since 1978. By 1981, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention had begun formally tracking the deaths, and what they found was staggering. Between 1981 and 1988, the CDC received reports of 117 cases of what they termed sudden unexplained nocturnal death syndrome among Southeast Asian refugees. All but one of the victims were male. The median age was 33. 75% of the dead were between 25 and 44 years old. None had a history of fainting, epilepsy, or heart disease. The deaths occurred between 10 at night and 8 in the morning, and witnesses consistently described the same terminal sequence: groaning, gasping, gurgling, labored breathing, and then silence. At its peak in 1981, the death rate among Hmong men aged 25 to 44 was 92 per 100,000, a number so staggering that it was comparable to the combined total of the 4 leading causes of natural death among all American males in that age group. In other words, for Hmong men in America, dying inexplicably in your sleep was the single most dangerous thing that could happen to you. Headlines began to appear in newspapers across the country. The The Los Angeles Times ran stories with titles like "Mysterious Fatal Malady Striking Hmong Men" and "Night Deaths of Asian Men Unexplained." The medical community was baffled. Autopsies were performed, and they revealed nothing. The men's hearts were healthy. Their blood showed no toxins. Their brains were normal. Some pathologists noticed subtle anomalies in the cardiac conduction systems of certain victims, the network of specialized cells that coordinates the electrical signals telling the heart when and how to beat. But these findings were inconsistent and did not constitute a definitive cause of death. The medical establishment had a syndrome, but no explanation. The Hmong community, however, did have an explanation, and it was one that the Western medical establishment initially dismissed, but would eventually be forced to take very seriously. In Hmong traditional belief, the world is populated by spirits, both benevolent and malevolent. Among the most feared of these is a being called the Dab Tsog, a pressing nightmare spirit that comes in the night and sits on the chests of its victims, crushing them and stealing their breath. The Dab Tsog is described as evil and inhabiting dark places like caves and caverns. It targets men specifically because in Hmong culture, men are the keepers of the ancestral spirits and are responsible for performing the rituals and ceremonies that maintain the spiritual health of the family. If a man fails in his duties, if he does not feed the ancestral spirits, if he does not perform the proper ceremonies, the Dab Tsog can reach him and take his life. In Laos, the Dab Tsog was feared, but rarely fatal. When a man experienced a Dab Tsog attack, waking in the night unable to move, feeling the crushing weight on his chest, sensing the malevolent presence in the room, his family would know exactly what to do. They would not panic, and they would not treat it as a death sentence. Instead, they would consult a shaman, a Tiksiv Neeb, a spiritual healer who could communicate with the spirit world and who possessed the rituals and knowledge to restore the cosmic balance that had been disrupted. The shaman would perform elaborate healing ceremonies that could last for hours or even days, involving chanting, the rhythmic beating of a gong, ritual sacrifice of a pig or a chicken, the tying of sacred strings around the patient's wrists, and the creation of protective talismans to be placed around the home. The ancestor spirits would be fed and appeased. The Dab Tsog would be confronted, challenged, and driven away. And life would continue. The attack was a warning, not a death sentence. It meant that something was out of balance in the spiritual realm, and the shaman's job was to restore that balance. It was a frightening experience, certainly, but it was manageable within the cultural infrastructure of Hmong society, where every family knew a shaman, where the rituals were familiar and trusted, and where the spiritual world was as real and as navigable as the physical one. But in America, that infrastructure had been destroyed. The dispersal policy meant that many Hmong families were living in isolation, far from other Hmong communities, and far from anyone with the knowledge to perform the necessary rituals. Shamans were scarce. Animal sacrifice, a cornerstone of Hmong healing ceremonies, was forbidden in the United States. Many Hmong men could not speak English, could not find work, and could not fulfill their traditional roles as providers and spiritual guardians. The clan structures that had supported Hmong society for centuries were in tatters, and the men who experienced the pressing, suffocating sensation of a Dab Tsog attack found themselves with no recourse, no shaman to call, no ceremony to perform, and no ancestral spirits close enough to protect them. They were alone with the spirit, and they believed with absolute certainty that it was going to kill them. The terror this generated cannot be overstated. As word of the death spread through Hmong communities, men became desperate. Some began sleeping in shifts, staying awake as long as they could, and setting alarm clocks to go off every 20 or 30 minutes to prevent themselves from sinking into deep sleep. Others tried to avoid sleep altogether. Some even began sleeping dressed in women's clothing, hoping that the Dab Tsog, like the Widow Ghost of Thailand, would be confused and pass them by. But the cruel irony was that these measures, taken out of fear, may have actually made the problem worse. Sleep deprivation is one of the strongest known triggers for sleep paralysis. By staying awake for days at a time or fragmenting their sleep with constant interruptions, these men were dramatically increasing the likelihood that they would experience the very episodes they were trying to avoid. And each new episode of sleep paralysis, experienced in the absence of any cultural mechanism for coping with it, would ratchet the terror and the stress higher and higher, creating a feedback loop from which there was no escape. It was this paradox that caught the attention of a young graduate student named Shelley Adler, who was studying medical anthropology at the University of California, San Francisco. Adler was fascinated by the intersection of belief and biology, and the Hmong deaths represented perhaps the most dramatic example of that intersection that the modern world had ever seen. She traveled to Stockton, California, home to one of the largest Hmong communities in the United States, and over the course of several years, she conducted in-depth interviews with 118 Hmong men and women about their experiences with the Dab Tsog. What she found was revelatory. The Hmong people she interviewed described experiences that were textbook sleep paralysis, waking up unable to move, feeling a crushing weight on the chest, sensing an evil presence in the room, being unable to breathe or cry out. But these experiences were not random or meaningless to the people who had them. They were encounters with a known entity, the Dab Tsog, and within the framework of Hmong belief, an encounter with the Dab Tsog carried very specific implications. It meant that the ancestral spirits were angry. It meant that the man had failed in his spiritual duties. And it meant that unless corrective action was taken immediately, the Dab Tsog would return and finish the job. In Laos, Adler learned, people experience Dab Tsog attacks regularly. But fatal outcomes were virtually unheard of. The cultural infrastructure was in place to handle them, but in America, where that infrastructure had been stripped away, the experience had been transformed from a manageable crisis into a death sentence. Adler theorized that what was killing these men was not the sleep paralysis itself, which is common and generally harmless, but the meaning they assigned to it, amplified by the extreme psychological stress of their refugee experience. She called this the nocebo effect, the dark mirror image of the placebo effect. Just as a person who believes they are receiving effective medicine can experience real, measurable health improvements from a sugar pill, a person who believes with absolute conviction that they are under spiritual attack and about to die can experience real, measurable, physiological consequences. Their stress hormones surge, their heart rate skyrockets, their blood pressure spikes, and if they carry a genetic vulnerability, if they have, say, a subtle abnormality in the electrical wiring of their hearts that they have never been aware of, that cascade of fear and stress can trigger a fatal cardiac arrhythmia. Their heart, already structurally compromised in a way that would never show up on a routine physical, begins to beat erratically, then chaotically, then not at all. This is where the story of the Hmong sleep deaths intersects with a pivotal moment in the history of cardiology, a moment that would ultimately connect the supernatural folklore of Southeast Asia to the cold, precise language of genetics and molecular biology. In 1986, a 3-year-old boy from Poland was brought to the attention of a Spanish cardiologist named Pedro Brugada, who was practicing in Belgium at the time. The boy had been having repeated episodes of fainting, losing consciousness without warning, and then recovering, and his family's medical history contained a devastating detail. His sister had already died suddenly and without explanation. His electrocardiogram showed an unusual pattern that Brugada had never seen before, a distinctive elevation of the ST segment in the right precordial leads, a part of the ECG readout that reflects the electrical activity of the right side of the heart. It was a subtle finding, the kind of thing that many cardiologists would have dismissed as a harmless variant. But Pedro Brugada did not dismiss it. He collected more cases, collaborating with his brother Joseph, and in 1992, the Brugada brothers published a landmark paper describing a new clinical entity, a genetic cardiac condition characterized by specific ECG abnormalities and an elevated risk of sudden death due to ventricular fibrillation, particularly during sleep. The condition would come to bear their name, Brugada Syndrome. In the years that followed, researchers around the world began connecting the dots. They discovered that Brugada syndrome was caused by mutations in the SCN5A gene, which encodes the sodium channels that regulate the electrical activity of the heart. When these channels malfunction, the heart's rhythm can become unstable, particularly during the deep relaxation of sleep. And crucially, they discovered that Brugada syndrome was far more common in Southeast Asian populations than in any other group on Earth. The incidence in Thailand and other parts of Southeast Asia was estimated at 1 in 1,000, roughly twice the rate found in Western populations. In 1997, a team of researchers led by Dr. Kunlawi Nademani examined 27 Thai men who had survived Lai Tai episodes and found that the overwhelming majority of them displayed the characteristic ECG pattern of Brugada syndrome. Subsequent genetic studies confirmed that Lai Tai, Pokuri, Bangungut, and sudden unexplained nocturnal death syndrome were all manifestations of the same underlying genetic disorder. The mystery of the sleeping deaths had not one cause but two: a genetic vulnerability that loaded the gun, and a trigger, whether it was stress, sleep paralysis, the nocebo effect of cultural belief, or some combination of all three that pulled it. The discovery of Brugada syndrome did not fully close the case, though, because it could not explain everything. If the condition was genetic, why did the Hmong deaths peak so dramatically in the early 1980s and then decline? Why were immigrants and refugees dying at far higher rates than people of the same ethnic backgrounds living in their home countries? Why did the deaths cluster within the first 2 years after arriving in America and then taper off? Brugada syndrome was clearly part of the answer, but the full picture required something more, something that connected the biology of the heart to the psychology of the mind and the cultural beliefs that shaped how people experienced the darkest moments of the night. Adler's nocebo hypothesis provided that missing piece. The men who died were caught in a perfect storm of vulnerability, a genetic predisposition to cardiac arrhythmia, compounded by the extreme stress of war, displacement, and cultural destruction, compounded further by sleep deprivation and the biochemical toll it takes on the body, and then triggered by the shattering experience of sleep paralysis, which they interpreted not as a neurological glitch, but as a death sentence delivered by an unstoppable spiritual entity. The terror was real, the belief was real, and the physiological consequences were real. It was, in the most literal sense, death by nightmare, The cultural ripple effects of these deaths extended far beyond the Hmong community and reached into the very fabric of American popular culture in ways that most people never realized. In the early 1980s, a filmmaker named Wes Craven was struggling through one of the most difficult periods of his career and his personal life. Despite having directed 2 films that are now considered horror classics, The Last House on the Left in 1972 and The Hills Have Eyes. In 1977, Craven had fallen on hard times. He was broke, out of work, and dealing with personal problems that had cost him his house and pushed him into debt. He was desperately searching for his next project, for an idea powerful enough to revive his career, when he came across a series of articles in the Los Angeles Times that would change the course of horror cinema forever. The articles described young refugees from Cambodia and Laos who were dying in their sleep after experiencing terrifying nightmares. One story in particular captivated him, the account of a young Cambodian boy who had escaped the genocide of the killing fields with his family and arrived safely in the United States. But the boy began having violent nightmares and became terrified to sleep, telling his parents that something was chasing him in his dreams and that if he fell asleep, it would catch him and kill him. He fought to stay awake for days, and when he finally succumbed to exhaustion, his parents heard him screaming in the middle of the night. By the time they reached him, he was dead. He had died in the middle of a nightmare. That story, along with several other similar articles that Craven found about unexplained nocturnal deaths among Southeast Asian refugees, became the seed from which one of the most iconic horror films in cinema history would grow. In 1984, Craven released A Nightmare on Elm Street, a film about a demon named Freddy Krueger who stalked teenagers in their dreams and killed them while they slept. The movie was a massive commercial and critical success, and it launched one of the most enduring franchises in horror history. But what most audience members never realized was that the central premise, the idea that something could kill you in your sleep through your dreams, was not simply a product of a filmmaker's imagination. It was drawn directly from real events and real deaths that were occurring in real time, in real American communities, to real people who were dying for reasons that no one could fully explain. The irony of the Hmong sleep deaths is that the solution, when it finally came, was not a drug or a surgical procedure or a medical breakthrough in the traditional sense. It was something far older and far simpler than any of that. It was community. As the 1980s progressed and Hmong families began to defy the government's dispersal policy, uprooting themselves from the scattered locations where they had been initially placed and migrating toward larger Hmong communities in the Twin Cities of Minnesota, Stockton and Fresno in California, and the Fox Valley of Wisconsin, something remarkable happened. The infrastructure that had been destroyed during resettlement began to rebuild itself, slowly and organically, like a forest regenerating after a fire. Shamans became available again. Clan leaders reasserted their roles. Cultural ceremonies were revived and adapted to the American context. Men who experienced Dab Tsog attacks now had someone to turn to, a shaman who could perform a healing ritual, a community that understood what they were going through, a framework for processing the experience that did not end in helpless terror. And as the cultural safety net was restored, the deaths declined. By 1987, the SUNDS death rate among Southeast Asian refugees in the United States had plummeted from its peak of 92 per 100,000 to just 1 per 100,000. The gene had not changed. Brugada Syndrome still lurked in the genomes of these men, as dangerous as ever. But the trigger, the nocebo, the paralyzing terror of believing yourself doomed with no recourse, had been diffused. Community and culture had accomplished what medicine could not. Today, the mystery of the sleep deaths is better understood than it has ever been, but it remains far from fully solved. Brugada Syndrome can now be detected with a relatively simple 12-lead electrocardiogram, and in some cases, the characteristic ECG pattern can be unmasked by administering sodium channel blocking drugs like agimaline or procainamide to patients who are suspected of carrying the condition, but whose resting ECGs appear normal. For those diagnosed, the gold standard treatment is the implantation of an implantable cardioverter defibrillator, a small device placed beneath the skin of the chest and connected to the heart by thin wires. The device continuously monitors the heart's rhythm, and if it detects ventricular fibrillation, the rapid, chaotic electrical activity that causes sudden death, it delivers an automatic electrical shock that resets the heart back to its normal rhythm. It is, in essence, a tiny paramedic that lives inside your body, standing guard while you sleep. In Thailand, the landmark debut trial, the defibrillator versus beta blockers for unexplained death in Thailand study, demonstrated conclusively that these devices were superior to medication alone in preventing sudden death among Lai Thai survivors. The Thai government approved their use for Brugada Syndrome patients in 2005, and research teams continue to explore more advanced interventions, including radiofrequency ablation of the cardiac tissue responsible for the abnormal electrical signals. In the Philippines, the Philippine Bangungut program was launched in 2023, spearheaded by researchers at the University of the Philippines and the Philippine General Hospital, to screen at-risk individuals, raise awareness about the condition, and provide access to potentially life-saving cardiac care. It was a long overdue step in a country where tens of thousands of young men remain at risk. But in much of rural Southeast Asia, where poverty limits access to advanced cardiac care, and where folk beliefs still powerfully shape how people understand the world, young men continue to die in their sleep, and their families continue to blame the spirits. The widow ghost still walks the rice paddies of northeastern Thailand. The Batibat still waits in the trunks of old trees in the Philippine countryside. And the Dab Tsog still presses its weight upon the chests of Hmong men who have failed to honor their ancestors. The story of sleep paralysis and the deaths it has contributed to is in many ways a story about the extraordinary and terrifying power of the human mind. It is a story about how belief shapes reality, how the meaning we assign to our experiences can quite literally determine whether we live or die. It is a story about the interplay between genes and environment, between biology and culture, between the heart that beats in your chest and the thoughts that race through your mind in the darkest hours of the night. And it is a reminder that even now, in an age of genome sequencing and implantable cardiac devices and sleep laboratories with polysomnographic monitors, there are places where the old spirits still walk, where the pressing weight descends in the darkness, and where the line between nightmare and death remains as thin as it has ever been. Sleep, after all, is the one thing that every single human being must do, and for a small but unlucky number of those humans, it is the last thing they will ever do. The night takes all of us eventually. For some, it simply comes sooner than it should. If these stories kept you up tonight, or if you found yourself reaching for the light switch more than usual, then this video did its job. If you enjoyed it, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to Dark Evidence. It helps the channel more than you know, and it means we can keep bringing you stories like this one, Stories about the strange, the unexplained, and the deeply unsettling corners of the world that most people would rather not look at. Until next time, sleep well, or at least try to.